The wolves of Ashenvale had waited 3 long years for their alpha king to choose a queen. Naya sat at the high table in a gown the color of winter frost, the queen's circlet pressing cold against her brow, and told herself tonight was the night everything she had endured would finally make sense. The wedding. She turned the word over in her mind the way a person turns a stone in their palm, testing its weight, making sure it is real. 6 months of ceremony and preparation had led to this hall. 6 months of fittings and council introductions and the careful, exhausting work of learning how to move through rooms that were not yet hers, how to meet the assessing eyes of pack leaders calculating her worth against the weight of a crown, how to hold herself with the quiet certainty of a woman who deserved to be here. She had managed all of it because of the way Kaelin looked at her when no one else was watching. For 8 months before the wedding, she had known a different version of him. The man who appeared at her chamber door in the quiet hours before dawn, with the composed armor of his public self stripped away, his expression open in a way she suspected very few living people had ever seen, whose hands, capable of ending a fight with a single motion, went completely still when he reached up to brush her hair from her face, as though she were something he was afraid to damage. Who had sat through the length of a storm with her when she could not sleep, not speaking, just present, because she had mentioned once that silence felt less threatening when another person was inside it. She had believed every word he had ever said to her. Her hand dropped beneath the table's edge and rested, almost without her permission, against the warmth that had settled low in her belly over the past 2 weeks. A secret too new and too fragile to speak aloud. Something that had shifted inside her so quietly she might have doubted it, except that the certainty had only grown stronger each morning since. She had planned to tell Kaelin tonight, after the court retired, in the stillness of the chambers that would finally, as of tonight, belong to them both. She had practiced the words. She had decided how she would hold her face when she said them. The High Elder rose, and the hall fell into the kind of silence that 2,000 wolves can produce when they all decide simultaneously to hold their breath. Naya looked at Kaelin. He sat beside her in ceremonial black, the Alpha King's seal at his collar, his profile cut sharp against the blazing chandeliers. She searched his face for the private man she knew, for some flicker of the tenderness he kept sealed away from the world and gave only to her, in darkened corridors and early mornings, and the space between one breath and the next, when he thought no one was watching, even her. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance. Flat. Empty. Absent in a way that raised the small hairs at the back of her neck before she could name why. She touched his hand beneath the table. He did not respond. She told herself it was the weight of the occasion, the pressure of 2,000 witnesses, the stillness that some men retreated into when the world demanded too much of them at once. She told herself she knew him, and that she knew this. She was still telling herself this when the High Elder finished speaking and Kaelin rose. Not to address his court, not to speak the words of completion that tradition and every witness in that hall expected. The acknowledgement of his queen, the declaration before his pack that she was chosen and claimed and beside him by right. He rose from his chair at the high table and he turned his back on it. The celebration did not die immediately. It requires a moment for an enormous thing to be understood. The music played 2 more notes. The laughter at one of the far tables completed itself. And then, in the way that fire understands a change in the air before the flame has time to show it, the hall went quiet. Every wolf in Thornspire watched their Alpha King walk the full length of the feasting hall. Naya watched too. She watched him move with a strange mechanical quality, his stride stripped of the fluid predator's grace she knew so well, his gaze directed at a point at the far end of the room with a fixed, vacant precision, as though he were following a path he had not chosen. He stopped before the delegation from House Varek, before Vendra. Naya had heard the name in the careful way people say a thing they believe will matter eventually. Vendra of House Varek, whose family controlled the eastern trade passes, whose bloodline had been maneuvering itself toward the Ashenvale crown since before Kaelin's father had sat it, who had attended the wedding as a courtesy guest and had accepted the invitation with a graciousness that, at the time, had read as appropriate and now read as something else entirely. She was striking. Tall, assembled with the precision of a woman who had been prepared for important rooms, her gown a deep arterial crimson that made everything around it look dim by comparison. She rose as Kaelin approached with the composed ease of someone who had been expecting this moment and had decided long ago exactly how she would look when it arrived. Kaelin held out his hand. Vendra took it. And the Alpha King of Ashenvale, on the night of his wedding, walked out of the feasting hall with another woman, while his queen sat at the high table with her hands folded and her spine straight, and his air growing small and new and secret inside her. The doors at the far end of the hall closed. The sound they made was very small. That was what Naya would remember most in the nights that followed. Not the silence of 2,000 wolves, not the face of Lord Caius Varek at his family's table, not quite managing to conceal the satisfaction spreading beneath his composed expression, not the court healer leaning to whisper something behind her hand to the woman beside her. The sound the doors made. The soft, definitive finality of it. Naya sat very still. The bonding mark at her throat, placed there 3 hours ago in the ceremony that was supposed to begin the rest of her life, burned with a heat that was nothing like the warmth she had felt when Kaelin first pressed his lips to that spot. This was different, a searing, dissonant sensation, as though something had been introduced into the bond that did not belong there. She gave them nothing. Not a tremor, not a tear, not a single breath too fast or too slow. She was aware of a hand settling on the back of her chair. She did not turn immediately. She allowed herself 3 full breaths. Then she looked. The man standing behind her had arrived that morning at the head of the Duskral delegation, required by the standing treaty between the 2 kingdoms to attend and witness the union of a neighboring Alpha King. She had been presented to him during the morning's formalities, a brief and formal exchange with no more substance than a dozen similar introductions that day. His name was Sorin. He was the Alpha King of Duskral, which made him the most powerful man in this hall after Kaelin, and he had spent the entire ceremony with the watchful stillness of a person who makes it their business to understand everything and disclose nothing. She had noticed him once, during the introductions, for a single reason. When he had looked at her, his expression had contained no calculation, no assessment of her value, no angle being worked. He had simply looked at her as though she were a person, and then looked away. Now those same quiet eyes held hers above the ruin of her wedding feast, and he said nothing at all, and the hand at the back of her chair was perfectly steady. Naya reached up. She removed the queen's circlet from her brow. She set it on the table between the cooling feast and the scattered flowers and the 2 untouched goblets. And the small sound it made against the wood was the quietest and most absolute thing she had ever done. She rose. She looked at the court of Ashenvale for one moment, at the faces of pack leaders and nobles and warriors who had pledged to follow a crown she had just set down, and she said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Then she walked toward the doors, and Sorin fell into step beside her without being asked, and behind them the feasting hall of Thornspire breathed out like something slowly going dark. The night air outside was cold enough to cut bone. Naya kept walking. The village of Harrowfen sat at the northern edge of Sorin's territory like an afterthought the rest of the world had quietly agreed to forget. Naya had chosen it herself, 10 days into her stay at Duskral's seat of power, when it became clear to both of them that her remaining inside the capital walls was a problem neither of them could afford. She was a deposed queen under a rival king's roof. Every day she stayed, the story that Sorin had orchestrated her departure gained one more day of credibility in the courts that were already constructing it. She was a liability dressed as a person, and they both knew it. He had not tried to argue her out of leaving. He had simply looked at her across the long table in the room where they had been attempting to negotiate the logistics of her situation, and said that he would arrange whatever she needed, and then he had arranged it. Down to the cottage with the southward-facing windows and the herb garden that had been left to seed by whoever last occupied it. She had not thanked him properly. She was not sure yet how to thank someone for a thing so large it did not fit inside normal words. Now it was deep winter in Harrow Fen, and she had become simply Nara, the quiet young woman from the southern coast who had arrived in grief and stayed because the village had offered her something to do. She delivered medicines to the old and the sick. She sat with the village healer on afternoons when the work was more than one pair of hands could manage. She kept to herself with the kind of consistency that polite people eventually stopped questioning. At night, she lay awake with her hand resting on her belly and thought about what she had left. The bonding mark at her throat had not faded. She had examined it every morning in the small cracked mirror above the wash basin. Among wolf kind, a bond broken or refused was supposed to dissolve within days, the flesh returning to smooth and unremarkable skin, while the bond itself retreated into the quiet category of things that had once been possible and were no longer. It should have been gone inside a week. Instead, it pulsed. Not with warmth. Not with the gentle resonance of connection she had felt in the early months with Kaelin, when standing near him had made the world settle into focus the way eyes adjust to good light. This was something searching and irregular, a low throb that woke her at unpredictable hours and pressed against the underside of her awareness like a question she could not hear clearly enough to answer. It made no sense. And she was too tired and too careful with her own hope to chase the meaning of a thing that should not exist. Then, 3 weeks after her arrival, on a morning when the frost had sealed every window in the cottage and the fire had burned low overnight, and the world outside was the particular white silence of deep winter, she understood something she had been avoiding. Naya sat down on the stone floor. She pressed both palms flat to her stomach. Outside, a child somewhere in the village was laughing at something. The sound carried clean and indifferent through the cold air. The world continued with the complete unconcern of a world that does not reorganize itself around a single woman's realizations. She was carrying Kaelin's child. The mark at her throat pulsed once, slowly, like something listening. She stayed on the floor for a long time. The trader arrived in Harrofen on the first morning of the thaw, his cart loaded with smoked provisions and the accumulated gossip of someone who had spent months on the road moving between kingdoms and talking to anyone willing to buy him a drink. Naya heard most of it secondhand, through old Petra, who ran the village's only inn with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been observing human nature long enough to find it predictable. Petra was not given to alarm. She had managed the steady traffic of border travelers for 30 years and had developed the composure of someone who had heard most stories at least twice. The expression on her face when she appeared in Naya's doorway that evening was careful in a way that was not her usual careful. Naya set down the route she had been measuring and waited. The trader, Petra said, had come through Thornspire 4 weeks ago. He had been present in the capital during the days immediately following the wedding, selling winter stores to the castle kitchens, which meant he had been inside Ashenvale's walls when what happened after the wedding had happened. And what had happened, Petra said, watching Naya's face with quiet attention, was this. The Alpha King had not taken Vendra of House Varric to his chambers on the night of the wedding. Naya went very still. He had been found the following morning in the east corridor, slumped against the wall outside a chamber door he had never opened. He had been alone. He had no memory of the hours between rising from the high table and waking on the stone floor. The court healer had been summoned and had found no injury, no illness, and no explanation that fit neatly into any category. Vendra had been located separately, in a guest chamber on the west wing, equally undisturbed, and equally unable to account for herself. Whatever had walked them out of the feasting hall and into the castle's interior had delivered them to separate rooms and left no trace of itself. Naya pressed her hand flat to the work table, but Petra was not finished. The morning after, before his council had assembled, before his guard had been given any instruction at all, the Alpha King had moved through Thornspire with a focused and frantic energy that the court had never seen from him. He had gone, immediately and directly, to a specific part of the castle, to her chambers. He had gone through them with the urgency of a man looking for proof that a thing was real. He had stood in the corridor afterward with the few things she had left behind held in his hands, and the expression on his face had been something the servants who witnessed it did not have words to describe adequately. And then he had begun to search. The whole of Ashenvale knew about it now. Wolves dispatched to every province. Gold offered for information. The court fracturing between those who believed their king had lost his mind to grief and those who believed that something deliberate had been done to him, and that the answer to what that something was had walked out of the feasting hall that night and had not yet been found. The eastern crops had been failing for 6 weeks. Pack wolves along the border territories were restless, shifting without cause, answering instincts nobody could trace to a source. The Alpha King had not slept in his own chambers since the morning after the wedding. Petra finished speaking and left without asking anything. Naya sat alone in the cottage while the last of the winter light withdrew from the windows. A man who chooses another woman does not search the kingdom for the one he left behind. The thought arrived with the quiet insistence of something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. She pressed it away. She had done this for weeks, and she had become competent at it. The way a person becomes competent at any repetitive and necessary task. But tonight, it did not go as far. The mark at her throat had been burning steadily for the past hour, directional in a way it had not been before, oriented south and slightly east as though her own body understood something she was refusing to. She pressed her fingers to it. She was 3 months into a pregnancy she had told no one about, hiding in a borrowed village under a borrowed name, and the bond that should have dissolved on the night of the wedding was not only still present, but pulling toward a man who was apparently dismantling his kingdom to find her, for reasons that no longer fit the story she had constructed to survive her exile. Outside, the last of the thaw dripped steadily from the cottage eaves, and then it stopped. Naya raised her head. The silence that replaced it was not the silence of a quiet night. It was the silence of something that had decided to be still. She crossed to the window without lighting a candle. The forest at the edge of the village was dark and absolute. She studied the tree line the way a person studies a thing they are hoping to find empty. It was not empty. A shape stood between the oaks at the tree line's edge. Still. Watching. Too large and too deliberate to be anything other than what it was. A wolf. And it was looking directly at her window. She did not move away from the window. The wolf at the tree line held its position with a stillness that was nothing like the stillness of an animal at rest. Animals at rest settle into themselves. This wolf was contained in the way of a person choosing to be still, the way of a being that had a purpose and was giving her time to understand it. A second shape appeared from between the oaks, then a third. Naya stepped back from the glass. She crossed to the back door and pressed her palm flat against it, listening. Then she moved to the side window that faced the lane. Then the small shuttered opening above the hearth that looked out toward the road. There were wolves at all of them, not moving, not advancing, simply present, as though they had arranged themselves to demonstrate that every direction she might choose had already been considered. She counted 7 that she could see. Her hand came to rest on the swell of her belly. She was not going to run. There was nowhere to run to. Whoever had sent these wolves had sent enough of them to make the point clearly, and she had spent too long inside a court of alphas to believe that panic was anything other than information given freely to the wrong people. She went to the hearth instead and lifted the iron hook from its bracket on the wall, because it was the only thing in the cottage with any weight to it, and because holding something solid helped her think. She was still holding it when the knock came. One knock. Deliberate. Quiet in a way that suggested the person on the other side was aware of the sleeping village and had no particular interest in disturbing it. Not the knock of someone intending to break the door down. The knock of someone who had traveled a long distance and needed her to understand that they were choosing courtesy. Naya crossed the cottage in 4 steps and opened the door before she could reason herself out of it. The man who stood on her threshold was not large. He was middle-aged and lean, his dark hair shot through with silver, his face carrying the specific hollows that months of insufficient sleep leave on a person who is otherwise disciplined enough to hide their condition. He was dressed in the clothes of a common traveler, deliberately unremarkable, which was itself a detail. She recognized him. She had seen him in the corridors outside Kalen's council chamber on more mornings than she could count. He had always been present before dawn with the patient precision of a man whose entire function was to make someone else's life run without friction. She had learned his name from a castle servant months ago because she had always made it her business to learn the names that mattered in rooms she occupied. Orin, Kalen's first beta. He looked at her with an expression she could not name cleanly. Relief and grief occupying the same face, and underneath both of them something older and more exhausted than either. "My lady," he said, and the words came out rougher than she suspected he had intended. "I have been looking for you for a very long time." Behind him, at the tree line's edge, the wolf she had been watching lowered its head and sat down in the snow. Naya stepped back from the doorway. He came in. Orin sat at her table and told her everything in the careful, precise manner of a man who had been rehearsing this conversation for months. He had found the first piece of evidence 6 weeks after the wedding, when one of Kalen's guard captains had traced an unusual supply order backward through 4 separate intermediaries to a provisioner whose primary income came from servicing the households of Ashenvale's noble families. The provisioner had been paid, in advance, and in unmarked coin, to include in the delivery of ordinary wine to the castle's pre-ceremony receiving chambers 3 bottles from a much older and separately prepared stock. Stock that had been treated. The compound was referenced in the oldest pharmacological texts as moonroot extract, derived from a flowering plant that grew exclusively in the high mountain passes of the Eastern Territories. The same eastern passes that House Varek had controlled for 3 generations. It had not been used as a weapon in living memory because its effects were considered too unpredictable for reliable deployment. It suppressed the wolf's instinct entirely while leaving the body's motor function largely intact, producing a kind of occupied vacancy in the affected person. A human puppet with no wolf inside it to resist direction. It erased memory cleanly for the duration of its effect, which ran between 8 and 14 hours depending on the dose. Someone had administered it to Kalen before his own wedding. They had relied on the fact that a wolf stripped of his instincts would simply follow the most visible social suggestion available to him, which in a hall of 2,000 guests gathered for a wedding was the expectation of the ceremony itself, and the most conspicuously positioned woman in that expectation had been Vendra of House Varek, placed there 2 years in advance precisely for this moment. He had not chosen Vendra. He had been walked toward her by a body that had been emptied of everything that would have refused. Naya kept her hands flat on her knees beneath the table and kept her eyes on Orin's face, and did not allow herself to look away or to feel the full weight of what she was being told. Not yet, because feeling it fully would require her to stop functioning, and she could not afford to stop functioning. She asked the question that had been assembling itself since Orin had said the word treated. Who had ordered it? House Varek, Orin said. The Varek family had been building the architecture of the plan for 2 full years. Lord Caius Varric had ensured his daughter appeared at every significant gathering in the 18 months before the wedding. Every council celebration, every Interpact summit, every occasion where Vendra could be seen and noted as a familiar presence in Kaelin's peripheral vision, because the compound worked best when the target's suppressed instincts had an obvious social context to follow. They had been methodical because the plan required methodology. They had used Kaelin's own wedding as their mechanism because it was the single occasion no one would question why a member of House Varric was standing in the room. When the wedding concluded as they had designed it to, they had expected Naya to dissolve quietly into the category of things the court chose to forget. A queen for 3 hours with no family name powerful enough to anchor a challenge. The kind of wound a kingdom absorbs and moves past inside a season. They had not expected her to walk out with the Alpha King of Duskrall. Naya thought about Soren's hand at the back of her chair. The completeness of the steadiness of it. She looked at Oren. She asked the second question, the one she had been aware of since he first said the name, Duskrall. Oren was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man choosing his words not to obscure the truth, but to present it as accurately as he could manage. Soren had known, he said, not about the compound specifically, but that House Varric was planning something significant for the wedding. He had intelligence gathered over the preceding year through his own network of sources inside the eastern trade routes, people who moved information the way merchants move goods. He had known something was going to happen. He had come to Ashenvale because he believed his presence as a formal treaty witness might function as a deterrent. He had not warned Kaelin. The silence in the cottage held everything it needed to hold, without either of them putting words into it. Oren said he could not answer why Soren had made that choice. He said Kaelin had asked the same question the morning the intelligence about Soren's foreknowledge had surfaced, and that the answer, or the absence of one, had produced a specific kind of anger that Oren had not seen from Kaelin since the early years of his kingship, when his control over his wolf was still a thing he had to maintain by effort rather than habit. Then Oren withdrew a folded letter from inside his coat and set it on the table between them. The seal was broken. The serpent crest of House Varric pressed into dark wax. It had been taken from a courier moving south through the Duskrall border territories 3 weeks ago. Naya picked it up. The message was 4 lines. The former queen has been located. She shelters under the Northern King's protection, which complicates direct approach. Indirect arrangements have been made in the village where she is kept. The matter will be resolved before the next quarter moon. Kaelin's heir cannot be allowed to exist. She set it back on the table. The quarter moon was 4 days from now. Oren's eyes were steady on her face. The king has been moving toward you for 3 months. The bond has been guiding him. But this is a large kingdom, and he has been careful not to alert House Varric's informants to his direction of travel. He is closer than he has ever been. But he is not yet close enough. Outside, one of the wolves stationed at the tree line made a short, sharp sound. Not a howl. An alert. Then another. Oren was on his feet before the second sound finished. They are here, he said. The first window broke before Naya had finished moving to the back wall. Not an arrow. A stone, wrapped in dark cloth to suppress the sound, punching through the old glass and striking the hearthstones with a flat, hard crack. Smoke began rising from it immediately. Oren moved with the decisive speed of a wolf who had spent 4 decades in the service of an Alpha King. His hand caught her arm and pulled her toward the interior wall, away from the windows, away from the smoke that was beginning to thicken the air with something that smelled like something acrid and chemical, sharp in the throat even at low concentration. They are not here to retrieve you, he said, his voice low and absolutely level. Stay behind me, and stay low. Through the ruined window she could hear the night disassembling itself outside. The wolves Oren had posted around the cottage had engaged with something in the tree line. The sounds were close and violent. Harrowfin was going to wake. People would come to their windows and then to their doors, and both of those things would get people killed tonight. Oren shifted. The lean, silver-haired man who had sat across her table was gone in the span of a single breath. The wolf that replaced him was the color of dark ash and winter birch, larger than his human frame had suggested, his entire attention fixed on the back door with the absolute focus of a being that had reduced the world to a single priority. The back door shook in its frame. Naya pressed herself flat against the interior wall. She had been aware of the bond mark at her throat throughout her exile in the way a person is aware of an injury that will not resolve. A constant, low presence. A thing that existed and demanded acknowledgement and offered no explanation for itself. She had treated it as passive, as something that happened to her rather than something she could act through. She was not certain what made her act differently in this moment. Possibly the smoke in the air, possibly the sound of violence outside, possibly the quality of terror that arrives when you understand that the threat is not arriving at some future point, but is present now, on the other side of a door. She pressed her palm to the mark, and she pushed, not physically, through it. The way she might push a door she had not previously understood was on a hinge. She pushed everything that was moving through her chest outward through the mark, through the bond, through whatever connective tissue existed between her and the wolves circling her cottage. The fury that had been living inside her since the night of the wedding. The grief she had been too careful to fully inhabit. The ferocious, specific protectiveness of a woman whose child was being threatened inside her own body. She pushed it all outward and felt it travel. The wolves attacking the back door stopped. Not gradually. At once. The pressure against the wood ceased entirely, replaced by a confused, low sound she had never heard from a wolf before. A lost, disoriented quality, like animals that have been moving with complete certainty and have suddenly found the certainty removed from beneath them. Paws in snow, scrambling away. Silence on the backside of the cottage. Through the broken window she heard two of the wolves in the tree line break away from the engagement and flee north, without apparent direction. Running the way animals run when they no longer understand where they are going but understand that they need to go somewhere. But not all of them broke. The back door opened. Not forced. Opened with the calm, practiced efficiency of someone who had approached this particular problem from outside the wolf's emotional register entirely. A person, in dark clothing. A strip of cloth across the lower half of his face. Eyes that crossed the room in a single sweep and located her with the quick, professional precision of someone who had done this kind of work before and had very few feelings about it. Those eyes found hers and held them. And she understood she had run out of immediate options. Oren came off the floor. The wolf hit the assassin with the full force of months of searching compressed into a single motion, and what followed was brief in the way that the most serious kinds of violence are brief. Not theatrical. Simply consequential. The cottage wall cracked where Oren struck it on the return, and he dropped, shifted back to human form, and did not immediately get up. The man crossed toward Naya. She pushed again through the mark. Harder. Past the point where the effort felt like choice, and into the territory where it felt like tearing. The man's step slowed. Something registered behind his eyes that was not on the list of things his mission required him to feel. He stopped, but he did not leave. He reached inside his coat a second time. The howl came from the southern edge of the village without warning. One voice, enormous and singular, and absolutely clear in the cold night air, carrying a frequency she had never heard directed at her, but recognized with a certainty that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the mark burning at her throat. The assassin's hand stopped inside his coat. His head turned toward the sound. The howl came again. Closer now. Moving through Harrowfen at a speed that suggested whatever was producing it was not particularly concerned about being heard. Every wolf within range of it went completely still, including, for 3 suspended seconds, the man standing in her cottage with his hand inside his coat. His face, behind the cloth, had changed. Not much, just enough. Naya had seen that specific expression before, on the faces of wolves in Kalen's court on the rare occasions when the Alpha King had entered a room already in tension. That involuntary rearrangement of confidence into something more careful. What she was looking at on this man's face, in this moment, was fear. The cottage door came off its hinges, not from impact. From the proximity of something that had decided doors were a concept too small for what it was carrying. The wolf that stepped through the frame was black from nose to tail, enormous in the way that stops being about size and becomes about presence, every inch of it radiating an authority so complete it was almost a physical weight in the room. The assassin, who had not broken composure in front of anything that evening, looked at it for one full second and ran. He cleared the broken window cleanly and disappeared into the dark, and Naya would think later that this was probably the most honest reaction she witnessed that night. The wolf stood in the smoke, and the shattered glass and the place where Oren had fallen, and its eyes, burning gold in the dark, found her immediately, and did not leave her. She could not move. The bond mark at her throat had passed through burning into something that had no words she knew, a heat so complete it had become indistinguishable from the rest of her. 3 months of distance and she could feel him breathing. The wolf shifted. The man who replaced it was not composed. He was wearing plain travel clothes, his face carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who had not stopped moving in days, his eyes still carrying gold that had not fully retreated. He stood in the ruins of her cottage and looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they have been told might not still exist. He said her name, not as a declaration, not as an arrival, just her name, in the voice she had heard only in memory all those months, spoken with the tenderness of a person who has been carrying something carefully for a long time and is setting it down at last. She had no time to respond. A second figure filled the doorway. Soren stepped through the ruined frame, assessed the room, and stopped when his eyes reached Kalen. The two Alpha Kings regarded each other across 6 feet of destroyed cottage, and the air between them had the quality of weather about to break. Naya stepped between them. She did not plan it. She simply understood, in the way she had learned to understand things in rooms full of alphas, that the space between them would resolve itself in the next 3 seconds with or without her occupying it. And the version where she occupied it was the version where everyone walked out. "Not tonight," she said. "Not in my cottage, and not over my head." The silence that followed tested itself. Kalen looked at her, and something happened in his face. The gold in his eyes reduced itself by a controlled degree, the wolf pulling back an inch. What replaced it was not calm, but the specific, deliberate quality of a man choosing to hear something even when everything in him is pulling toward a different response. He looked down at Oren. He crossed the cottage, went to one knee, and pressed his hand to the beta's chest. The gesture was automatic and completely unself-conscious. An alpha taking measure of a wolf who had served him. "He is stable," Kalen said. Then he looked up at her. "Are you hurt? Not are you all right? Are you hurt?" The practicality of it, the care underneath its specific language, the fact that his first coherent sentence to her after all this time was not about him at all, did something to the structure she had been maintaining inside her chest since the night of the wedding. "No," she said. He nodded. He rose from Oren's side and turned to face her fully, and she saw for the first time the face of a man who had been carrying something for months that had no proper place to put. "I woke up on the floor of a corridor in my own castle," Kalen said, his voice low and stripped of everything except accuracy. "I had no memory of the previous night. The bond was wrong in a way I had no word for, as though something that had been present had been removed while I was unconscious. I went to your chamber, and everything you had left was already cold." Naya said nothing. "They told me what the court had witnessed. I understood immediately what you must have seen, and what you must have concluded. And I want you to know that I understood it not as an excuse, but as the truth of what I cost you. And what do you want me to do with that, Kaelin? Nothing, he said without hesitation. I am not telling you so that you will be quicker to forgive me. I am telling you because every version of what I rehearsed saying to you sounded like a man trying to talk his way out of something he has no right to talk his way out of. The mark at her throat pulsed once, warm and deliberate. Something inside Naya shifted. It was not forgiveness. It was not relief. It was the recognition that the man in front of her was not managing her. He was not deploying the language of accountability as a tactic. He was simply, with the stripped-back honesty of a person who has run out of ways to be strategic about their own pain, telling her the truth. She had 3 months of truth to tell him in return. She would tell it. But before she could speak, Soren said, "There is something I need to tell you both. About why I did not warn you. Before we go any further, because it changes the shape of what comes after." Kaelin looked at him with the precise, contained fury of a man who has been waiting months to ask a question. "Then tell me," he said. Soren told them everything. He told it the way he appeared to do most things, with an economy of language and no audible attempt to arrange the facts in a light more favorable to himself. He had developed intelligence over the preceding year, through sources inside the Eastern Trade Network, that House Varric was planning a significant move around the royal wedding. He had not known the specific mechanism. He had known the general intent. He had also known, from a source closer to Ashenvale's court, that there was someone inside Kaelin's inner council passing information to Lord Varric, which meant any direct warning he sent through conventional channels had a meaningful probability of reaching the Varric household before it reached Kaelin himself. He had calculated that a direct warning would alert Varric to change their approach. He had calculated that his presence in Thornspire as a formal treaty witness, an alpha king from a rival territory with no reason to be neutral about any disruption to Ashenvale's stability, would be deterrent enough. He had been wrong. Kaelin said nothing. He was watching Soren with a stillness that was not passivity but controlled listening, the stillness of a person absorbing something they intend to return to at the appropriate moment. Soren continued. "There was a second part," he said. "He came to Ashenvale not only because of the intelligence about House Varric's plans. He came because he did not know who was going to make a move or what the outcome would be, and he wanted Duskrall position to benefit regardless. He had been watching Ashenvale's political fractures for 3 years. He had been building relationships with pack leaders in the Eastern Territories who were dissatisfied with the Ashenvale crown. He had come to Thornspire with the intent of someone who saw a board about to shift and wanted to be present when it did. When Naya walked out with him, he had understood, in the carriage on the road north, exactly how advantageous her presence in Duskrall was. A deposed queen with a valid bond to the Alpha King of Ashenvale, under his protection. The leverage that implied was substantial. He had not used it. "Why?" Kaelin said. Soren looked at Naya. "Because, after 3 months of watching her survive what your kingdom did to her on her own wedding night," he said, "I found that I could not look at her as a political instrument without understanding exactly what kind of man that made me, and I do not particularly want to be that man." The silence in the cottage was the quietest it had been all night. Naya looked at the floor between them, at the precise midpoint of the triangle the three of them were forming, and she felt very clearly that she was standing inside a moment that would mean different things to each of them for the rest of their lives. Then Kaelin crossed to her. He did not touch her. He stood close, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him after her months of absence, and he waited. "Tell me," he said. So she told him, all of it. The night of the wedding, watching from the darkness of her own hall as her husband walked away from her. The months in Harrowfen under a false name. The morning on the stone floor of the cottage when she understood she was not alone inside her own skin. When she reached that part, Kaelin went completely still. She kept her eyes on his face. "I was going to tell you the night of the wedding," she said. "I had practiced the words. You were going to come to our chambers after the feast, and I was going to tell you, and then—" She stopped. Then she continued. "I have been carrying this alone for 3 months." Something happened to Kaylin's face that she had not seen before. Something structural, as though the composure he maintained in front of the entire world had simply stopped being an available option. He reached for her hand, not to pull her toward him, not as a claim. Just his hand finding hers and holding it with a careful, deliberate pressure. "I am here now," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a declaration. It was the simplest possible statement of a simple and enormous fact, and it was exactly the right thing to say. She closed her fingers around his. It was Oren's voice, rough with pain from the floor that broke the quiet. "My king." A pause while Oren gathered himself. "You need to hear what the Varric letter said. And then we need to move." Kaylin did not release her hand. "Tell me," he said. Oren told them what the letter contained, what arrangements the Varrics had made inside Ashenvale during his absence, and what was waiting for them in Thornspire. The quarter moon was 3 days away. They rode through 2 nights and a day with barely enough stops to breathe the horses. Naya rode beside Kaylin, not in front of him this time, but beside him, because she had told him quietly as they mounted that she was not a passenger in whatever came next, and he had looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory, and said only, "No, I know you are not." Soren rode with them. No one had formally asked him to. No one had formally told him not to. He had simply appeared at the edge of the road as they departed Harrowfen, his own horse saddled and ready, and when Kaylin looked at him across the gray morning light, Soren had said there was a source inside Kaylin's inner council he had identified, and that naming, he could not wait. Oren traveled in the cart they commandeered from the village, lying flat for the first day before the wolf's constitution began its slow work, and he was sitting upright by the second morning, gray-faced but functional. Kaylin had jerked his head toward the road and Soren had fallen in beside them, and that was the end of the conversation. Thornspire appeared on the horizon in the gray hour before full dawn, its towers cutting the pale sky the way they always had, and Naya felt the sight of it in a way she had not expected, a recognition that surprised her with its depth. She had spent 6 months learning those spires and those walls. She had walked those corridors in the dark. She had stood at that window and pressed her fingers to the frost. It was not the home she had hoped it would be when she left. She was not certain yet what it was. The scouts Kaylin had sent ahead met them at the outer road with a report that clarified rapidly into a picture with hard edges. Lord Caius Varric had arrived in Thornspire 11 weeks ago, presenting himself as a concerned ally, a senior nobleman stepping in to manage the kingdom's affairs during the period of what he called the King's Bond Grief. He had arrived with 200 of his own people, all of them positioned in key roles throughout the castle before anyone who might object had understood what was being assembled. 7 council members who had refused to cooperate with his interim authority had been quietly removed from their positions on charges of destabilizing the realm. Vendra had been formally presented to the remaining council as acting queen by a vote of 8 members to 3, the 3 dissenters now under what Varric termed protective custody. 17 pack leaders who had refused to acknowledge the acting queen's authority had been similarly detained. The Varric banner did not fly over Thornspire. Caius Varric was too careful for that. The royal crest remained in place, and he had been careful to present everything as temporary, administrative, conducted entirely in the king's best interests, which meant that when Kaylin arrived, Varric could not run. Running would confirm what he had done. His only remaining play was to stand in the hall he had been occupying for 11 weeks and make Kalen prove, before the council and the detained pack leaders and the assembled household, that he was the king and not the broken, bond-mad wreck Varric had been describing. The castle gates opened without resistance. Varric had been waiting for them. He stood at the top of the great stairs in the formal robes of a regent, his silver-haired composure intact, Vendra arranged precisely at his right side. He spread his hands in a gesture of welcome that contained every calculation he had ever made, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the forecourt with the studied ease of a man who had been preparing this moment for weeks. "My king," he said, "you have returned. We have been keeping everything safe in your absence." Beside Naya, she felt Kalen's horse shift beneath the tension moving through him. "I know what you have been doing," Kalen said. "Then you know it was done entirely for Ashenvale." Varric's eyes moved to Naya, and the warmth in them did not reach whatever was behind them. "Though I see you have brought the former queen, there will be those on the council who question the wisdom of that." "Let them," Naya said. Varric smiled. "The council chamber is assembled, my king. I suggest we resolve the questions of legitimacy and succession before anything further is decided." He turned and walked inside. And they followed him in, all of them, because it was the only direction the situation had left. The council chamber held 60 people in formal assembly. Pack leaders who had refused to cooperate with Varric occupied the left side of the room, some of them still visibly marked by weeks of detention. The 8 council members who had voted Vendra her temporary queenship occupied the right, with Varric's 200 behind them like a wall. The remaining 3 dissenters who had survived their removal sat against the far wall with the careful stillness of people who had been waiting to see how this ended. Vendra sat in the ceremonial chair at the council table's head. She rose when they entered. Her expression was composed, and she looked at Naya once, a single, assessing look, and then looked at her father. Caius Varric took the floor with the ease of a man who had been holding it for 11 weeks. He spoke for a long time about the necessity of stable governance during periods of crisis. He spoke about the precedent of temporary regency. He spoke about the concern of the council and the pack leaders and the household regarding their king's state of mind, his obsessive 3-month search for a woman who, Varric said with genuine sorrow in his voice, had chosen to leave with a rival king on the night of her own wedding, suggesting a prior understanding between them that raised serious questions about the validity of the bonding ceremony itself. He suggested, with great apparent reluctance, that the council consider a formal inquiry into the king's fitness to rule. The chamber was very quiet. Naya listened to all of it. She stood slightly behind Kalen, and she felt through the bond mark the precise quality of the fury he was managing. A thing so large and so controlled, it was almost more frightening than if he had simply let it loose. Then she stepped forward. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She moved to the center of the floor, and the room's attention shifted to her with the speed that rooms always shift when someone moves with that combination of certainty and calm. "I am Naya," she said. "I am Kalen's bonded mate. The mark of that bond is on my throat and his, placed there by the High Elder at the bonding ceremony, which this man watched, and which none of you have the authority to declare void regardless of what was administered to the king's wine that night." The silence deepened. "Under the old law," she continued, "a bonded mate in an active bond has the right to demand testimony before the assembled packs, rather than judgment by council vote. I am invoking that right." Varric's composure remained intact. "The lady's bond status is precisely what is under question." "Then question it in front of the pack leaders you have been detaining," Naya said. "Release them into this room, and let them hear what I have to say, and let them decide." The detained pack leaders stirred. Varric's eyes moved across them. She watched him calculate. 17 pack leaders, all of them detained for refusing to accept Vendra's authority, all of them with grievances that had been accumulating for weeks. If he refused to release them now, in this room, in front of this assembly, the refusal would say precisely what Naya needed it to say. "Release them," Kalen said, and his voice was the voice of a king who has been waiting for exactly this moment. Varek's guard hesitated. Varek said, "Release them." The pack leaders entered the chamber and took positions along the walls, and the room changed its shape entirely. Naya spoke. She told them what Oren had found: the moonroot extract, the 4 intermediaries between Varek and the treated wine, the courier letter intercepted at the Duskrell border. She did not perform outrage. She presented facts with the precision of a woman who had spent months in exile with nothing to do but understand exactly what had been done to her and why. And then she said, "I am carrying Kalen's heir." The chamber held a breath so complete it seemed to suspend time. "Your assassins were sent to ensure this child would not exist," she said, looking at Caius Varek directly. "The letter said so. I have it here." She set the letter on the council table. Varek's composure had not broken. It was extraordinary to watch, the degree of control the man possessed. But something had shifted in it, a hairline fracture that widened by a fraction as Naya stood in the center of his carefully constructed architecture and refused to be the secret he needed her to be. "Seize her," he said. His guard moved. Soren stepped in front of her. Not Kalen, Soren. The Alpha King of Duskrell, who had no formal standing in this chamber, who was present as a treaty witness and nothing more, planted himself between Naya and the Varek guard with the absolute, unhurried authority of a man who has made a decision and has no interest in discussing it. "I would not," he said. The guard stopped. Kalen looked at Soren for a moment. Something passed between the two men that Naya could not read precisely but recognized as significant. Then Kalen turned to face the council chamber fully, and the thing that had been building in him since the cottage, since the wedding night, since months of searching, finally broke the surface. Kalen shifted in the council chamber. He had not done this in a formal assembly in 11 years. The standing prohibition against it existed for good reason. An alpha in wolf form in a closed room of 60 people was not a display of authority, but a disruption of it. An act that bypassed the entire framework of governance and appeal that distinguished a king from an apex predator occupying a building. He did it anyway. The shift took under 2 seconds, and the wolf that replaced him was not the frantic, searching animal that had burst through Naya's cottage door. This was something different. This wolf had arrived. It stood in the center of the council chamber with a stillness so complete it seemed to draw the air in the room toward it, and every wolf present, including the ones in Varek's guard, felt the full, unmedicated weight of an alpha who had been separated from his mate and done permitting obstacles. Nobody moved. Naya felt the bond respond. Through the mark at her throat, through the thread she had been learning to push outward throughout her exile, she felt the full force of what was moving through it from his side. It was not the searching, desperate pulse of the weeks in Harrow Fen. It was something complete and present, the way a fire feels when you are standing at its center rather than watching it from a distance. She laid her palm flat against the mark at her throat, and instead of pushing, she pulled. She had never tried this. She had pushed in the cottage with fear and fury and protectiveness, and it had worked in the ways it had worked. But this was different. This was not about driving something away. This was about drawing something home. She pulled on the bond with everything she had, every honest thing she had felt through her exile, and refused herself the luxury of fully feeling. The grief of the wedding night, the cold mornings in Harrow Fen, the morning on the stone floor when she understood she was not alone, the nights she had spent convincing herself the dreams were not real when she had always known, underneath the argument that they were. The moment in the cottage when Kalen had said her name the way he said it, and her body had understood something before her mind had formed words around it. She pulled it all toward the bond and let it move. The wolf in the center of the council chamber raised its head. It turned toward her. Every person in that chamber understood they were watching something that had nothing to do with politics. The wolf crossed the floor and stopped before her. And then, with a slowness that had nothing threatening in it, it shifted. Not the explosive brevity of combat, the long, deliberate shift of a being choosing to return to human form, because the human form was the one that could speak to her. Kalen stood in front of her in the center of the council chamber. He was breathing hard. His eyes were still holding gold. He looked at her face with the total attention of a man who has stopped dividing himself between this moment and any other. He spoke the formal words. Not the wedding ceremony words, the older words, the words that existed before ceremony did, before protocol and council and the architecture of governance that had been built around the simple and enormous fact of what a true bond between two wolves actually was. He spoke them to her, in front of 60 witnesses, and the pack leaders along the walls and the council members whose votes had been engineered by someone who had not understood that you cannot vote on a fact. The mark at her throat did not burn. It settled. The sensation was so distinct, so complete, so absolutely unlike the restless pulse it had maintained through her exile, that Naya understood without needing it explained to her that this was what finished felt like. Not dramatic, not loud, just finally, fully present. She said the words back to him. The old words moved through the chamber, and from the pack leaders along the walls the first sound came. Not a howl, not a cheer. Something quieter and more serious, the sound of wolves recognizing something true. Caius Varek moved. He had waited, Naya would think later, with considerable discipline. He had watched his entire construction disassemble piece by piece in front of an audience that had been assembled specifically to witness it. He had watched his guard stopped by Soren and his authority stripped by testimony, and his legal architecture dismantled by a woman who refused to be invisible. He had contained all of it behind that extraordinary composure. What broke it was not the bond. It was the sound of the pack leaders. He drew the blade from inside his formal robes and moved toward Naya with the committed speed of someone who understood one option remained. Naya saw it before it arrived. She pushed through the bond, harder than the cottage, harder than anything she had done before. She pushed with the full force of a completed bond behind it, not just a thread now, but a connection that ran in both directions with nothing blocking it. And what moved through it was not fury and not fear, but something that had no name she knew, the specific ferocity of a woman protecting the life she has decided to keep. The chamber full of wolves staggered. Varek's hand faltered. The blade caught the light and missed. Soren caught Varek from behind. The man went down. Vendra looked at her father on the floor of the council chamber, and the composure she had maintained through the entire proceeding collapsed at once, not dramatically, just completely, in the way that composure collapses when there is nothing left to maintain it for. She said, "I did not know about the child." Her voice was very small. "I did not know they were going to send anyone after her." Nobody responded to that immediately. Oren's voice came from the doorway, thinner than it should have been, rough with the effort of having crossed the castle on an injury that had not yet had the time it needed. "My king," Oren said, "I have the list of Varek's informants inside the council. All 7 of them, including the primary source Lord Soren identified. I believe this would be a good moment to present it." Kalen did not look away from Naya. "Yes," he said, "I believe it would." The business of aftermath took the rest of that day and most of the next. Caius Varek was placed in custody before the council chamber had been fully emptied. The 7 members of the council identified by Oren's list were removed from their positions pending formal inquiry. The 17 detained pack leaders were released without conditions and given the specific and formal apology that Kalen delivered to each of them individually, which was not required by law and was entirely consistent with the kind of king he was and had been before the Varric plan had stripped these past months from all of them. Vendra was not imprisoned. She was escorted from Thornspire with 3 members of household staff and her personal possessions, stripped of the title and standing her father had arranged for her, and given 7 days to reach the family's eastern estate before a formal hearing would begin into her knowledge of what had been planned. Whether she had known all of it, or part of it, or none of it would be determined by testimony rather than assumption. Naya had said this was the right approach. Kaelin had agreed without hesitation. Through all of it, Oren stood and sat, and occasionally leaned against walls with the careful discipline of a wolf who refused to acknowledge that he was not yet well. On the second morning, Naya found him in the corridor outside the king's council chamber, seated on a stone bench with his eyes closed and the particular gray color to his skin that she recognized from her time working alongside the village healer in Harrowfen. She sat down beside him. She had not done this before. What she had done in the cottage was reactive, instinctive, driven by the desperate energy of a crisis. She had pushed through the bond with emotion and found that it moved. She had pulled through it in the council chamber with something more complete, and found that it could carry more than she had understood. Whether this was possible she could not say with certainty, only that she suspected it the same way she had suspected the push before she did it, as a thing that lived in the logic of what the bond actually was. She pressed her hand to Oren's arm. She pressed the other hand to the mark at her throat. She pulled on the bond the way she had in the council chamber, but instead of drawing it toward herself, she tried to redirect it, to aim the warmth of it outward toward the cold gray she could feel under her palm. Not fury this time, not grief. Simply the warmth of a bond that was running clean and complete and full. Oren breathed in sharply. He opened his eyes. Color returned to his face with a slowness that she found obscurely more moving than the rapid changes of the previous 2 days. Not dramatic, just gradual and honest and real. His expression, for a long moment, was the one she had seen at her cottage door, the relief and the grief together. But this time there was something else underneath them, something that looked, improbably, like awe. "My lady," he said, and this time the roughness in his voice was not exhaustion. She removed her hand from his arm. She said nothing, because some things do not require commentary. Soren left on the 3rd day. He came to find her in the garden that she had started learning the layout of again, in the early morning before the day's work began. He stood at the garden's edge with his horse's reins in his hand and the quiet he always carried. And he said that Duskrell's political situation required his attention, and he had stayed as long as he could reasonably justify. She told him she understood. He nodded. He looked at her with those river-deep eyes, and she understood that he was allowing himself one honest moment before he closed it. He said he hoped the child would be healthy. He said he hoped the kingdom would be steady. He said with a careful precision that he had not regretted the decision he made in the feasting hall, to stand at the back of her chair. He never said he regretted the decision he had made before that. The one in the carriage, the calculation he had attempted and then quietly abandoned. It did not need saying. Naya said, "You will be a good king, Soren." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once more, mounted, and rode north. She watched him go until the road curved and took him from sight. The daughter arrived on a warm evening in late summer. She was small and certain, the way some people are certain from the first moment, with her father's black hair and eyes that were already deciding what color they would be, and Naya's particular expression of focused assessment that Kaelin had been watching across rooms for the better part of 2 years. He held her with the hands of a man who has carried the fear of loss for a long time and is only now beginning to understand that the thing he feared losing is here, in his arms, looking up at him with complete and unsentimental attention. He did not speak for a long time. Her name, he said finally, without looking up from the child's face. You choose, Naya said. He thought about it. She watched him thinking about it, the specific care of a person approaching something they want to get right. He said the name quietly, once, as though testing how it sounded in the real air rather than inside his own head. She heard it and understood that he had chosen it for the same reason she would have chosen it, which was the best possible outcome of the decision. She held out her arms and he gave the child back to her, and then sat beside her on the narrow bed in the way that large people sit in small spaces when they are entirely satisfied with where they are. It was late, and the window was open, and outside Thornspire, the evening carried the sounds of a kingdom that was learning to be steady again. The pack leaders had returned to their territories. The council had been reconstituted. The formal inquiry into House Varek's actions was proceeding with the deliberate pace of a process that intended to reach the right conclusion rather than the fast one. Caius Varek would face judgment before the assembled packs. He had known this since the moment Soren caught him in the council chamber, and he had stopped performing composure entirely somewhere in the second day of his custody, which Oren reported with the mild satisfaction of someone who had been watching the performance for 11 weeks. The mark at Naya's throat had healed into a scar the color of moonlight on water, and it no longer burned or pulsed or surged. Kalen pressed his lips to it. She felt the bond hum between them with the warmth of something that could not be manufactured, that could not be legislated into existence or engineered through a compound in a wine bottle or dismantled by 3 months of separation and grief and exile and everything that had been assembled against them. She felt the child in her arms. She felt the warmth of him beside her. She felt the scar at her throat under his lips, and she felt it for exactly what it was, a beginning that had refused to be an ending. Always, she said softly to both of them and to neither of them and to the room that had become the thing she had learned, against considerable evidence, to call home. Outside, a single wolf lifted its voice in the spring evening, then another, then more, until the whole of Thornspire was ringed with sound. Not grief this time, not searching. Something that had finally, completely arrived. Thank you for listening.